We began our discussion of fallacious or erroneous reasoning by generally discussing what a fallacy is and distinguishing fallacious reasoning from strong reasoning in the case of empirical reasoning and from valid reasoning in the case of non-empirical or deductive reasoning. Now what we're going to do is begin to focus on categories or classes of fallacies. So as you may recall from the overview, and we'll revisit that in just a moment, but it's not the case that the classification of fallacies is hard and fast. In other words, different texts will classify fallacies under different headings, but really the criteria for all of the fallacies are the same insofar as the reasoning is weak. So the reasoning is empirical, the reasoning is weak, and the reasoning is weak to the point where the premises or the evidence really just do not adequately support the conclusion. But we can be more specific in terms of these criteria, and that's why we have the various classifications that you see depending on what sort of or which textbook you pick up. So recall that one of the ways in which we can begin to classify fallacies or organize fallacies is in terms of whether or not they involve personal attacks and emotional appeals, whether or not they involve really poor causal or analogical reasoning, whether or not there are assumptions that, when made explicit, reveal themselves to provide entirely inadequate support for the conclusion, or where rather than the argument going in a direction that we think that the argument should go, some sort of diversionary tactic is used. And then in all cases, there's a problem ultimately of relevance, right? Because if the premises don't support the conclusion, then there's an important way in which the fallacies just aren't relevant, or sorry, where the support just isn't relevant, or where the conclusion isn't relevant to the support. So what we're going to do in any case, in all these cases though, is focus on how we can recognize these fallacies in our ordinary language. So to that end, we're going to adopt a classification scheme as follows. We begin with the linguistic fallacies, equivocation and amphiboly. Then we're going to move on to so-called relevance fallacies, weak induction fallacies, and then finally presumption fallacies. But again, this is an approach that I've adopted that is not by any stretch standard. Again, what's more important than the taxonomy of fallacies is that you can analyze a fallacy successfully. So to that end, let's begin with a reminder of what it is we're talking about when we talk about a fallacy. A fallacy is an error. So a fallacious argument is an erroneous argument or a defective argument. We know already when we talk about formal fallacies that we're talking about invalid arguments. And we looked at least two standard formal fallacies. These are the two imposters that pretty much everybody learns when they learn about formal fallacies. That's denying the antecedent and affirming the consequent. But really, any invalid argument is a formally fallacious argument. An informal fallacy is a fallacy of experiential reasoning gone wrong. And you're going to find that even though these examples that we'll see, or these types of error that we'll see, are errors we don't want to commit ourselves, we'll find that they can be incredibly compelling. And that's often because they rely on certain habitual ways we have of thinking. They rely on some sort of psychological component. They sort of prey on psychological features. They prey on certain emotional states. So being able to detect an informal fallacy is an incredibly powerful tool for us to develop. As I mentioned before, though, we want to make sure that we can not only detect the error in reasoning, but that we can talk about what's gone wrong, how it's gone wrong, why we should avoid reasoning this way. And that's partly why we spend so much time focusing on what counts as solid reasoning. That gives us a pretty strong foundation for distinguishing that from erroneous reasoning. So one of the things that you want to bear in mind as we move forward here is to think about what counts as good reason for making a claim, good reason for believing that a claim is true. We want to think about what evidence is. And how we talk about evidence sometimes depends on the context, right? You can think about, for example, legal rules of evidence. You can think about scientific standards. You can think about sort of common ways, that is, ways that we um, uh, think about what counts as good evidence in our daily lives. So let's take a look at a couple of examples to get us going in the direction of our first study, which is the focus on linguistic fallacies. So here is a piece of reasoning from a book uh, entitled Fair Play, The Ethics of Sport. If each of us ought to be free to assume risks that we think are worth taking, shouldn't athletes have the same freedom as anyone else, for example, to take performance-enhancing drugs? In particular, if athletes prefer the gains in performance allegedly provided by the use of steroids, along with the increased risk of harm to the alternative of less risk and worse performance, what gives anyone the right to interfere with their choice? After all, if we should not forbid smokers from risking their health by smoking, why should we prohibit track stars or weightlifters from taking risks with their health in pursuit of their goals? Now, you already know from our study of analogical reasoning that one of the steps that we take when we analyze a piece of analogical reasoning is we detect or we identify the point of the reasoning. We look at the two items that are compared. We're looking to determine what the transfer is, right? So we look at a comparison between two objects or events or belief states and so forth, and we look at what the similarities are between them so that when we see what a further characteristic of one of those items is, we see that that characteristic is supposed to transfer over to the other or lesser known item. So here, the arguer wants to draw a conclusion about athletes being able to have the athletes um, being able to have the choice without fear of retribution to decide whether or not to take steroids. And that inference is based on a comparison between athletes and people who, for example, choose to smoke. So the various comparisons have to do with the risk taking that we allow people in some circumstances, and the idea is that we will allow that same risk to be transferred over. Okay, fair enough, but one of the questions that you have to ask is whether or not the relevant similarities are strong enough to outweigh the relevant dissimilarities, right? So, what is it that we allow people to do in their daily lives that we wouldn't allow people to do in the realm of amateur and professional sports? What is it that is different about these two realms? Moreover, is it the case that the choice of the smoker is unlimited? Is it the case that if the choice of the smoker is limited, should that not also apply if we're going to make this comparison to the athlete and so forth? So what we're looking for is the detection of ways in which the analogy breaks down. And we've talked about that. Are there unintended consequences? Can we come up with a counter analogy? Now take a look at this example of statistical reasoning. 93% of studies on student testing, including the use of large-scale and high-stakes standardized tests, found a positive effect on student achievement according to a peer-reviewed 100-year analysis of testing research completed in 2011 by testing scholar Richard P. Phelps. Therefore, standardized testing improves education in the U.S. Now, this reasoning is adapted from Phelps's essay. One of the things that we want to do here is ask ourselves about the nature of the sample. We want to ask ourselves if the target audience is relevant to the sample size and so forth. Right, so one of the things that we're looking for is a set of ways in which the fact that this overwhelming percentage of studies on student testing is or is not relevant to today's student and today's standardized testing in terms of the question about whether or not standardized testing improves education in the U.S. All right, so as you can probably imagine, given the brief and not entirely satisfactory discussion of the prior examples, but I hope we at least get a sense of what we're going to be doing, you know then that an argument should withstand scrutiny, that the argument does provide intellectually, not merely psychologically or emotionally compelling evidence for a claim, that a strong argument does not prey upon our emotions, our psychological states, prey upon some habitual ways we have of thinking. That latter point, I hope, will be more clear when we talk about, for example, equivocation and amphiboly. And that also we believe that a strong argument does not win by making a competing argument look bad. So let's lastly talk about the focus that we have on the study of fallacies, more specifically, the focus we have on analyzing a fallacy. It's one thing just to recognize that reasoning has gone wrong. It's one thing to be able to identify a particular fallacy name. It's another it's another thing altogether to be able to describe the error, right? To be able to explain what's gone wrong, what's the mechanism whereby the reasoning has failed, and to explain why we shouldn't reason this way. To that end, let me give you an example of an equivocation, which I recognize is an example that relies on knowing what an equivocation is, and we haven't discussed it yet, but I do this on purpose because I think you will recognize that we don't actually have to use the fallacy name in order to successfully identify and articulate what's gone wrong and to explain why we should avoid reasoning in the way that the example shows. So this is a joke. I was told by the logic book from which I take the joke that it was told on Saturday Night Live, but this must have been a very old episode. I couldn't find the actual clip of it. Every minute a man is mugged in New York City. We are going to interview him tonight. Now, the thing is funny, right? Ha ha ha. Why is it funny? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's reorganize the reasoning, and there are two formulations that are relevant here. I don't know that either of my formulation is wonderful. But hopefully, I hope it's the case rather that the reformulations get the job done. Reformulation 1. There is a man who is mugged in New York City. This mugging occurs every minute, so we are going to interview this man. Reformulation 2. Every minute, a different person is mugged in New York City, so we are going to interview one mugging victim. So what's gone wrong in the joke? I hope the reformulations highlight the issue. There are two interpretations of man, one of which leads to the interview inference in the joke. On one interpretation, it is the same individual who is mugged every minute. On the other interpretation, multiple individuals are mugged over the course of a 24-hour period. Conceivably, among those multiple individuals, one of those individuals is mugged multiple times. Most of us understand that the second version is correct, albeit not colloquially presented. The humor lies in the inference drawn in the first version, since this inference is unexpected. It's still plausible, however, given the grammar, right? So given the fact that man could mean this single individual, the same one, or could mean some individuals. All right, with that in mind, let's start looking at how we analyze equivocation, and then we will look at how we analyze amphiboly. So let's move on to talking about at least one way in which language itself can lead us into erroneous inferences. You'll notice that I have on this slide two fallacies. We're only covering one, equivocation, but it's worth looking at amphiboly as well. So first, let's think about what we're talking about when we talk about ambiguity in language. We're talking not simply about vagueness, that is, imprecise language, but we're talking about imprecise language in a specific way, partly because the language itself can't be more precise. So when a word means more than one, or sorry, let me rephrase that. When a word has more than one meaning, it's easy for us to slide, if you will, from one meaning to the next. And that is what is at the heart of equivocation. So take a moment to look at the definition, the explanation of the mechanism, as well as why the equivocation fallacy is an example of poor reasoning. And then we'll move on to some examples. So let me give you some visual ways to think about equivocation. So you'll notice that you're probably familiar with a number of visual, perceptual illusions. And I should be more precise to say it's not so much that these are illusions so much as depending on what you focus on, you will shift your perspective. So you've got the duck rabbit, you've got the old young woman, and by the way, pause if you need to see if you can see each. We've got the vase and the profile silhouette of a human profile silhouette. And then we have some examples. Go ahead and take a few moments to read through these and see if you can identify where the shift in meaning occurs. I think you'll find that the second example is more subtle than any of the others. The others are kind of for the point of humor, right? And so they tend to be a bit more obvious. But think about the word authority in the second example and see if you can see where the shift in meaning of authority takes place. Then we have some examples by way of cartoons, which are always loads of fun. If you've never read The Far Side, seen the Far Side cartoons, you should. They're wonderful. They are, these are not in the public domain, so I'm using them only by way of academic fair use. But I strongly recommend that you find yourself some Gary Larson Far Side works. They're wonderful. And then again, I know we're not covering Amphiboly, but pause the video if you like and read through these and see where the shift takes place based on a punctuation or a misplaced modifier error. I hope this brief presentation helps you orient your thinking as you begin your study of linguistic fallacies.